Zektar pressed his scaled claws against the metal railing and watched the strange, pale creatures below him in the cargo bay. The humans moved with such odd patterns, not like any warrior race he had seen in his 40 cycles of military service. Their skin looked soft and pink, almost fragile, like the shell-less creatures that lived in the shallow pools of his home world. No natural armor, no visible weapons growing from their bodies, no enhanced sensory organs that he could detect. Yet somehow these weak-looking beings had built ships that could travel between stars and weapons that could crack planets. The diplomatic vessel Convergence hummed quietly around him as it moved through hyperspace toward their destination. 3 months ago, the Galactic hegemony had made first contact with this species called humans from a small blue world they named Earth. The initial reports had been confusing. The humans possessed technology that was impressive but not revolutionary. Their military seemed competent but nothing special. Their culture was chaotic and diverse, lacking the unified purpose that made strong civilizations. But they had one thing that caught the hegemony's attention. They had survived. In a galaxy where most species either joined the hegemony for protection or fell to various threats, humans had thrived alone for thousands of years on a world that the xenobiology reports described as unusually hostile. Dense atmosphere, extreme weather patterns, aggressive native life forms, and geological instability that would have driven most species to abandon such a planet. Yet humans called it home and seemed to love it. Now, Zektar found himself assigned as military liaison to this joint mission, watching these soft creatures prepare for what might be their first real test alongside hegemony forces. The humans had volunteered to help respond to a distress call from mining colony Kepler 442b. Communications had gone dark 3 days ago, and long-range scans showed signs of possible hostile activity. Captain Jake Morrison stood near a table, covered with weapons that looked crude compared to Caltharian plasma rifles. The human was older than most warriors Zektar knew, with gray fur growing on his face and lines around his small eyes. Morrison moved slowly but deliberately, checking each weapon with careful attention. His uniform was plain and bore simple markings that seemed more functional than decorative. Lieutenant Amy Collins worked at a computer terminal nearby, her fingers moving quickly across the input surface. She was young for an officer, probably, barely out of training by human standards. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple style, and she wore the same plain uniform as Morrison. She spoke in quiet tones with other humans, discussing tactical scenarios and logistics in a calm manner that seemed almost casual. Sergeant Ben Parker sat on a supply crate, methodically cleaning a projectile weapon that fired metal slugs instead of energy bursts. He was thick and muscular by human standards, but still looked fragile compared to a Caltharian warrior. His hands worked with practiced efficiency, and Zektar noticed small scars on his arms and face. Battle marks, perhaps, though they seemed minor compared to the deep scoring that decorated most veteran Caltharian hides. Dr. Lisa Grant stood apart from the military personnel, examining biological samples in a portable laboratory setup. She was smaller than the others, with pale skin and light hair that she kept pushing away from her face as she worked. Her equipment looked designed for research rather than combat, yet she had requested to join the mission to the potentially dangerous colony. Zektar wondered why a scientist would volunteer for such risks. The humans engaged in behaviors that puzzled him. They consumed a dark liquid called coffee that seemed to have mild stimulant properties but required elaborate preparation rituals. They made jokes about serious topics and laughed at things that didn't seem particularly amusing. They touched each other frequently in ways that appeared friendly rather than dominance-related. Morrison would pat Parker on the shoulder, Collins would bump fists with other soldiers, and Grant would smile at everyone regardless of their rank or species. Most strange of all, they treated Zektar and the other Caltharian warriors as equals rather than superiors. In hegemony military culture, newer species typically showed deference to established warrior races like the Caltharians. Humans seemed unaware of or indifferent to such protocols. Morrison had introduced himself with a firm handshake and direct eye contact, behaviors that suggested either ignorance of proper military courtesy or remarkable confidence. The ship's communication system crackled to life, and the bridge officer announced their imminent arrival at Kepler 442b. Zektar felt his battle instincts sharpening as they prepared to drop out of hyperspace. The colony had been established 5 years ago to extract rare minerals from the planet's crust. The facility housed approximately 200 miners, technicians, and support staff from various hegemony species. The fact that all communication had ceased suggested either complete technical failure or something far worse. Morrison gathered the human team around him for a final briefing. His voice was steady and clear as he outlined the mission parameters. They would deploy in mixed teams, with humans and Caltharians working together to secure the colony and evacuate any survivors. The humans listened attentively, asking practical questions about equipment compatibility and communication protocols. They showed no signs of fear or excitement, just professional focus on the task ahead. Zektar joined his assigned human team as they moved toward the shuttle bay. Collins checked her scanner readings and reported that the planet's surface showed normal atmospheric conditions but no signs of electronic activity from the colony. The mining facility's power grid appeared to be offline, and there were no responses to any communication attempts. As they boarded the shuttle, Zektar noticed how the humans interacted with their equipment. They didn't just carry weapons. They seemed to understand them as tools with specific purposes and limitations. Parker adjusted his rifle's settings based on the planet's atmospheric density. Collins programmed their navigation system with multiple contingency routes. Morrison studied satellite images of the colony layout, memorizing details that might prove important. Dr. Grant surprised him by producing a sidearm from her research kit and checking its power cell with familiar efficiency. When she noticed his attention, she smiled and explained that all human scientists received basic combat training because their exploration missions often encountered unexpected dangers. The casual way she handled the weapon suggested she had used it before. The shuttle descended through the planet's atmosphere, and Zektar got his first view of Kepler 442b's surface. The mining colony sat in a valley surrounded by rocky hills, its metal structures gleaming under the local star's light. Everything looked normal from altitude, but as they approached, details became visible that raised Zektar's concern. Scorch marks on several buildings, debris scattered across the main courtyard, and no movement anywhere in the facility. Morrison spoke quietly into his communicator, coordinating with other shuttles carrying mixed teams to different landing zones around the colony. His tone remained calm and professional, but Zektar detected subtle changes in the human's posture and breathing that suggested increased alertness. The other humans showed similar signs of heightened awareness without any obvious fear or anxiety. Collins pointed to her scanner display and announced the detection of life signs in the colony's lower levels. The readings were scattered and weak, suggesting either injured survivors or something else entirely. Morrison nodded and adjusted their approach vector to land near the main entrance, where they could quickly access the underground areas. As the shuttle touched down, Zektar prepared his plasma rifle and activated his armor's defensive systems. Around him, the humans made their own preparations with quiet efficiency. Whatever had happened to the mining colony, they would soon discover the truth. He found himself curious to see how these soft, strange creatures would handle their first real test alongside hegemony forces. The shuttle's doors opened, and they stepped onto the surface of Kepler 442b, ready to face whatever waited in the silent colony ahead. The silence that greeted them as they left the shuttle felt wrong to Zektar. Mining colonies were never quiet during operational hours. There should have been the constant hum of extraction equipment, the voices of workers coordinating their tasks, the rumble of transport vehicles moving materials. Instead, only the wind whispered across the empty courtyard, stirring small pieces of debris that crunched under their feet as they advanced toward the main facility. Morrison held up his fist, and the mixed team stopped automatically. Zektar was impressed despite himself at how quickly the humans had adapted to standard hegemony military signals. The captain pointed to Collins, who immediately began scanning the area with her detection equipment. Her readings showed multiple heat signatures in the underground levels, but the patterns were strange and irregular. Dr. Grant knelt beside what looked like claw marks, scored deep into the metal wall of the nearest building. The gouges were too large and too deep to have been made by any known mining equipment. She ran her fingers along the scratches, measuring their depth and spacing with scientific precision. When she looked up at Morrison, her expression was serious but not panicked. Sergeant Parker moved to the main entrance and examined the doorway. The heavy security door had been torn apart from the outside, its reinforced metal peeled back like the skin of a fruit. Whatever had done this possessed incredible physical strength. Parker whistled softly and shook his head, but Zektar noticed the human seemed more interested than frightened by the display of destructive power. The team moved into the facility's main corridor, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. Emergency lighting cast red shadows on the walls, and Zektar could smell something in the air that made his scales prickle with instinctive alarm. It was a scent he recognized from old battlefields, the odor of death and decay mixed with something else, something alien and wrong. Collins stopped suddenly and held up her scanner, her face pale in the red light. The device was detecting massive movement in the lower levels, hundreds of large life forms moving in coordinated patterns. The readings were unlike anything in the hegemony's biological databases. Morrison studied the display over her shoulder and asked quiet questions about the creature's size and apparent behavior patterns. That was when they heard the sound. It started as a low vibration felt more than heard, then grew into a chittering, clicking noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sound echoed through the ventilation system and resonated in the metal walls around them. Zektar had heard similar sounds before in the worst nightmares of every hegemony military officer. Dr. Grant's eyes widened as she recognized the audio pattern. She grabbed Morrison's arm and spoke one word that made Zektar's blood run cold with remembered terror. HFY, the insectoid hive mind that had consumed entire star systems before the hegemony had learned to contain them, the species that turned living worlds into nightmare landscapes of organic metal and bone. The enemy that required orbital bombardment to defeat because no ground force had ever survived close contact with a mature hive. Morrison's reaction surprised Zektar completely. Instead of ordering immediate retreat or calling for evacuation, the human captain smiled. It was not a happy expression, but something colder and more calculating. He spoke quietly into his communicator, informing the other teams of the situation, and requesting they converge on the facility's lower levels. His voice was steady and calm, as if he were discussing routine patrol duties rather than facing the galaxy's most feared predators. Collins began adjusting her equipment settings, configuring her scanner to track HFY movement patterns and life signs. She worked with focused efficiency, showing no signs of the panic that would have been normal for someone encountering these creatures for the first time. When she finished, she reported that the aliens appeared to be concentrated in the mining tunnels beneath the colony, where they had likely established a breeding nest. Parker checked his weapons and ammunition with methodical care, counting projectiles, and testing firing mechanisms as if preparing for a routine training exercise. He asked Dr. Grant about HFY anatomy and weak points, listening carefully to her explanations of their chitinous armor plating and acidic blood. When she mentioned that previous encounters had resulted in 70% casualty rates for hegemony forces, he just nodded and adjusted his rifle's targeting system. Dr. Grant pulled up tactical files on her portable computer, displaying detailed anatomical diagrams of HFY warriors and queens. She pointed out structural vulnerabilities and explained the aliens' hive mind communication system, which relied on pheromone signals and electromagnetic pulses. Her scientific curiosity seemed stronger than any fear she might have felt about facing such dangerous creatures. The team moved deeper into the facility, following maintenance corridors toward the mining levels. The chittering sounds grew louder, and the smell of alien presence became stronger. Zektar's enhanced hearing detected movement in the walls around them, the scratch of claws on metal and the rustle of insectoid bodies navigating through ventilation shafts. The Vex-High knew they were coming and were preparing to defend their nest. Morrison paused at a junction and studied building schematics on Collins's scanner. He traced possible routes with his finger, identifying choke points and defensive positions where a small team might hold off larger numbers of enemies. His tactical thinking was sound, but Zektar wondered if the human truly understood what they were about to face. Vex-High warriors stood 8 feet tall, possessed natural armor that could deflect most weapons, and attacked with acidic saliva that could melt through military-grade protective gear. Collins detected the first group of aliens moving through, the tunnels below them. Her scanner showed 12 large signatures advancing toward their position, moving with the coordinated precision that marked Vex-High pack-hunting behavior. Morrison acknowledged the information and directed the team toward a maintenance shaft that would give them access to the mining levels while avoiding the main corridors where the aliens expected them to appear. As they descended through the facilities, Zektar found himself studying his human companions with growing confusion. They showed none of the fear responses he expected from a species encountering the Vex-High for the first time. Instead, they displayed the focused attention of predators preparing to hunt dangerous prey. Morrison's breathing was controlled and steady. Collins' hands were calm as she operated her equipment. Parker's grip on his weapon was relaxed, but ready. Dr. Grant continued taking notes about alien behavior patterns, as if this were a research expedition rather than a desperate survival situation. The maintenance shaft opened into a large chamber that had once housed mining equipment. Now it was filled with something else entirely. Organic structures that looked like a mixture of metal and bone covered the walls and ceiling. Pools of acidic fluid bubbled in corners where the aliens had dissolved unnecessary equipment to make room for their hive. The air was thick with the smell of decay and alien pheromones that made breathing difficult for most oxygen-based life forms, and everywhere, moving through the shadows with fluid grace, were the Vex-High themselves. Zektar counted at least 20 of the creatures visible in the chamber, their dark exoskeletons gleaming in the emergency lighting. Each one was a perfect killing machine, evolved over millions of years to hunt and consume other sentient species. Their compound eyes tracked movement with predator efficiency, and their razor-sharp limbs could slice through armor plating as easily as cutting soft tissue. Morrison raised his hand for silence and pointed to a group of heat signatures on Collins's scanner. Survivors from the mining colony, trapped in a storage room at the far end of the chamber. The only way to reach them was through the middle of the Vex-High nest, past dozens of aliens that would detect any intruders within seconds of their approach. Parker grinned as he studied the tactical situation, showing teeth in an expression that looked more threatening than reassuring. He whispered suggestions about flanking maneuvers and distraction techniques, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone anticipating an interesting challenge rather than dreading a suicidal mission. Dr. Grant made quiet observations about the hive's structure and organization, noting details that might be useful for understanding Vex-High behavior patterns. She seemed particularly interested in the way the aliens moved in relation to each other, as if she were trying to decode their communication methods and predict their responses to different stimuli. Zektar realized with growing unease that his human companions were not just unafraid of the Vex-High. They were studying them with the cold attention of scientists examining laboratory specimens. Whatever these soft, pale creatures truly were beneath their fragile appearance, they were not the helpless prey species he had assumed them to be. Morrison hand-signaled for the team to spread out along the chamber's perimeter, using the twisted organic structures for cover. Zektar positioned himself behind what had once been a support beam, but was now covered in the Vex-High's bone-like secretions. The material felt warm under his claws and seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm, as if the entire hive were one massive living organism. The first attack came without warning. 3 Vex-High warriors emerged from hidden alcoves in the walls, their movements flowing like liquid death as they converged on the team's position. Zektar raised his plasma rifle and fired at the nearest creature, his shot striking its armored thorax and sending it stumbling backward with a shriek of pain and rage. The alien's acidic blood sprayed across the floor, eating through metal and leaving smoking holes in the ground. But it was the human's response that made Zektar's breath catch in his throat. Instead of the desperate panic he expected from creatures facing their first Vex-High encounter, they moved with cold precision that seemed almost mechanical. Collins dropped to one knee and fired 3 rapid shots at the second alien's leg joints, targeting the narrow gaps in its armor with accuracy that suggested extensive study of Vex-High anatomy. Her projectile rounds punched through the creature's exoskeleton and sent it crashing to the ground. Parker rolled sideways as the third Vex-High leaped toward him, its razor-sharp claws extended to slice him apart. Instead of trying to run or seeking cover, the human sergeant came up firing, his weapon cycling through rounds so quickly the individual shots blended into a continuous roar. He wasn't just shooting at the alien, he was systematically destroying its mobility by targeting specific body parts with surgical precision. Dr. Grant surprised Zektar by producing a compact weapon from her research kit and adding her fire to the engagement. Her shots were carefully aimed at the wounded alien's sensory organs, blinding them and disrupting their ability to coordinate with the rest of the hive. She moved between cover positions with fluid efficiency, never staying in one place long enough for the Vex-High to track her position. Morrison coordinated the team's movements with quiet hand signals, directing their fire and positioning them to create overlapping fields of coverage. He seemed to understand Vex-High pack tactics instinctively, anticipating their attempts to flank and surrounding the aliens before they could execute their hunting strategies. When his rifle overheated from continuous firing, he switched to a sidearm without missing a beat. The 3 Vex-High lay dead within 60 seconds of their initial attack, their bodies leaking acidic fluids that continued to eat through the floor around them. Zektar stared at the carnage in amazement. He had seen hegemony elite forces struggle against single Vex-High warriors, yet these humans had eliminated 3 of them with methodical efficiency that bordered on the mechanical. But the noise of the battle had alerted the rest of the hive. Chittering calls echoed through the chamber as dozens of aliens began converging on their position from all directions. Collins's scanner showed massive movement throughout the facility as the entire nest mobilized to defend itself. The humans had perhaps 2 minutes before they would be completely surrounded by overwhelming numbers of the galaxy's most effective killers. Morrison studied the tactical display and made rapid decisions about their next moves. Instead of retreating or calling for evacuation, he directed the team toward the storage room where the survivors were trapped. He seemed to view the approaching horde of Vex-High not as an insurmountable threat, but as an obstacle to be overcome through proper planning and execution. Parker began setting explosive charges along their planned route, placing them at strategic points where falling debris would create choke points and limit the aliens' ability to coordinate their attacks. He worked with the casual efficiency of someone performing routine maintenance rather than preparing for desperate combat against superior numbers. When Collins asked about blast patterns and damage estimates, he answered with precise technical details while continuing to arm additional charges. Dr. Grant collected samples of Vex-High biological material as they moved, using her portable laboratory, equipment to analyze the aliens' acidic blood and organic secretions. She seemed particularly interested in the pheromone compounds that the creatures used for communication, taking detailed measurements and recording data even as more aliens approached their position from multiple directions. The next wave of attacks came from above as Vex-High warriors dropped from the ceiling like living missiles. Zektar barely had time to dodge before one of the creatures crashed into the spot where he had been standing, its claws gouging deep furrows in the metal floor. He rolled behind cover and returned fire, but his shots seemed less effective than the humans' precisely aimed rounds. Collins had somehow anticipated the aerial assault and was already firing upward as the aliens fell toward them. Her projectile weapon cycled through different ammunition types, switching from armor-piercing rounds to explosive charges depending on each target's position and armor configuration. She called out targeting information to the rest of the team in calm, clear tones that made their coordinated response possible. Morrison moved through the chaos with steady purpose, never hurrying but never hesitating as he engaged target after target. His weapon handling was economical and efficient, each shot carefully aimed to maximize damage while conserving ammunition. When two Vex-High charged him simultaneously from different angles, he killed the first with a precise headshot and used its falling body to shield himself from the second's attack. Parker laughed as he fought, actually enjoying the challenge of facing such deadly opponents. He had somehow acquired a Vex-High claw weapon and was using it alongside his rifle, switching between ranged and melee combat as the tactical situation demanded. His movements were fluid and adaptable, responding to each alien's attack pattern with appropriate countermeasures that suggested deep understanding of combat dynamics. Dr. Grant continued her scientific observations even while fighting for her life, making notes about Vex-High behavior patterns and physiological responses to different types of damage. She had discovered that certain frequency ranges disrupted their coordination signals, and she was using her portable equipment to broadcast interference patterns that caused groups of aliens to attack each other instead of focusing on the human team. The battle continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Zektar found himself falling behind the humans' pace, his traditional Caltharian combat training seeming clumsy and inefficient compared to their fluid adaptability. They moved like water, flowing around obstacles and reforming their attack patterns to meet each new threat with optimal response strategies. When Parker's explosive charges detonated, the sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Sections of the ceiling collapsed, crushing several Vex-High and creating barriers that channeled the remaining aliens into predetermined kill zones. Morrison had positioned his team to take advantage of the new terrain features, using the rubble and debris to maximize their defensive positions. Collins discovered that the storage room containing the survivors was directly ahead, but it was guarded by a massive Vex-High queen that had emerged from the deepest parts of the nest. The creature was 3 times larger than the warriors they had been fighting, with armor plating that looked impervious to conventional weapons and acid glands that could dissolve metal at 50 meters range. Morrison studied the queen's position and defensive posture for several seconds, then began issuing orders that made no sense to Zektar. Instead of retreating or calling for orbital support, the human captain was planning to engage the creature directly. He directed Collins to begin calculating structural weak points, while Parker prepared specialized ammunition designed to penetrate heavy armor plating. Dr. Grant pulled up detailed files about Vex-High Queen anatomy, identifying critical organs and nervous system vulnerabilities that might allow a small team to kill such a massive creature. She was treating the encounter as a research opportunity, rather than a death sentence, her scientific curiosity overriding any survival instincts that should have been screaming at her to run. As they prepared for what seemed like a suicidal assault against impossible odds, Zektar realized that something fundamental about these humans was different from every other species he had encountered. They were not just unafraid of the Vex-High. They were approaching the aliens as problems to be solved rather than enemies to be feared. Whatever these soft, pale creatures truly were, they possessed something that made them far more dangerous than their fragile appearance suggested. The Vex-High Queen dominated the chamber like a living fortress, her massive bulk blocking access to the storage room where the survivors waited. Zektar estimated she was at least 12 feet tall and probably weighed several tons. Her armored carapace looked thick enough to withstand direct hits from military-grade plasma cannons, and the acid dripping from her mandibles was eating through the metal floor like water through paper. Most terrifying were her eyes. Unlike the compound vision organs of the smaller warriors, the Queen possessed large, intelligent orbs that tracked the team's movements with obvious awareness and planning. She was not just a biological killing machine, but a thinking predator, capable of strategy and tactical adaptation. Previous hegemony encounters with Queen specimens had required orbital bombardment because no ground-based weapons could penetrate their defenses. Dr. Grant crouched behind a twisted support beam and activated her portable laboratory equipment, scanning the Queen's biological signatures with scientific fascination that bordered on the obsessive. She whispered rapid observations to Morrison about the creature's metabolic patterns, structural weak points, and probable behavioral responses to different stimuli. Her tone was that of a researcher discussing an interesting specimen rather than someone facing imminent death. Collins configured her scanner to map the Queen's body structure in real time, identifying armor thickness variations and potential vulnerability zones where their weapons might achieve meaningful penetration. She had somehow programmed her equipment to analyze Vex-High carapace density using reflected sound waves, creating a detailed anatomical diagram that updated continuously as the creature moved. Parker examined his remaining ammunition and began modifying his projectile rounds using components from his demolition kit. He was creating custom penetrator rounds designed specifically to exploit the weak points that Collins had identified, working with the focused concentration of an artist crafting a masterpiece. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, assembling each round to precise specifications. Morrison studied the tactical situation with the calm attention of someone solving a complex puzzle rather than planning a desperate assault against impossible odds. He pointed out structural features of the chamber that could be used for cover and concealment, identified possible flanking routes that might allow them to attack from unexpected angles, and calculated firing positions that would maximize their chances of hitting critical targets. The Queen began moving toward their position with fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so massive. Each step sent vibrations through the floor, and her breathing created gusts of acidic vapor that made the air difficult to breathe. She was not hurrying, but advancing with the confident patience of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. That was when Dr. Grant made an observation that changed everything. She had been monitoring the Queen's pheromone emissions and discovered something remarkable about the creature's communication patterns. Unlike the simple coordination signals used by warrior drones, the Queen was broadcasting complex chemical messages that suggested higher-level cognitive functions and emotional responses. More importantly, Grant had identified specific pheromone compounds that indicated fear. The Queen was afraid of something, though not of the team's weapons or tactical capabilities. Her chemical emissions showed anxiety patterns associated with territorial threats and reproductive concerns rather than immediate physical danger. Something about the human's presence was triggering deep-seated survival instincts that overrode her normal predatory confidence. Morrison listened to Grant's findings with growing interest, asking detailed questions about the Queen's emotional state and probable decision-making processes. He seemed to understand something about the creature's psychology that the others had missed, some crucial insight that might make the difference between survival and death. His expression became thoughtful rather than grim as he processed the new information. Collins detected additional movement in the tunnels beyond the chamber, suggesting that more Vex-High were approaching their position from the deeper parts of the nest. But instead of warrior drones or soldier casts, Her scanner readings indicated smaller, more fragile signatures that might be larvae or other non-combatant specimens. The queen was not just defending territory but protecting her offspring from perceived threats. Parker finished modifying his ammunition and began distributing the custom rounds to the rest of the team. Each projectile was designed to target specific anatomical features based on Grant's biological analysis and Collins' structural mapping. The humans were not just planning to fight the queen, but to hunt her, using detailed knowledge of her physiology and behavior patterns. Dr. Grant made another discovery that seemed to excite her more than frighten her. The queen's acid production was not constant but varied based on stress levels and emotional states. During periods of heightened anxiety, the creature's defensive secretions became more concentrated and corrosive, but this process also consumed metabolic resources that affected her mobility and reaction times. Morrison began issuing orders that made no tactical sense to Zektar, but seemed perfectly logical to the other humans. Instead of engaging the queen directly, they were going to manipulate her emotional responses using carefully planned stimuli designed to trigger specific behavioral patterns. They were treating the encounter as a psychological operation rather than a conventional military engagement. Collins activated her scanner's audio recording function and began broadcasting modified versions of the queen's own pheromone signals back at her, creating chemical confusion that disrupted her ability to communicate with the approaching reinforcements. The false signals convinced the other HFY that different threats were present in multiple locations, causing them to disperse their forces instead of coordinating a unified assault. Parker positioned himself to take advantage of the queen's probable movement patterns based on Grant's behavioral analysis. He was not trying to achieve optimal firing positions for his weapons, but placing himself where the creature would be most vulnerable to psychological manipulation. His role was to trigger specific emotional responses that would create tactical opportunities for the rest of the team. Dr. Grant continued monitoring the queen's biological responses and providing real-time updates about her mental state and probable decision-making processes. She had somehow learned to read HFY emotional patterns like a specialized language, interpreting chemical signals and physical behaviors to predict the creature's next actions with remarkable accuracy. The queen's advance slowed as Collins's false pheromone signals began affecting her coordination with the rest of the hive. She paused frequently to emit complex chemical messages, trying to re-establish communication with her scattered forces. Her massive head turned from side to side as she attempted to locate threats that existed only in the confused signals she was receiving. Morrison took advantage of the creature's distraction to advance closer to her position, moving with careful stealth that kept him below her visual tracking threshold. He was not trying to attack her directly, but positioning himself to exploit the psychological vulnerabilities that Grant had identified. His approach was that of a predator stalking prey rather than a soldier engaging an enemy. Parker began making subtle noises and movements designed to trigger the queen's territorial defense responses, causing her to focus her attention on perceived challenges to her authority rather than direct threats to her safety. He was using her own instincts against her, manipulating evolutionary programming that had been refined over millions of years to respond to specific stimuli. Collins detected the approach of the rescue survivors in the storage room and realized they had limited time before the queen's protective instincts overcame her confusion about the false signals. The creature's anxiety levels were increasing as she sensed potential threats to her offspring, and her acid production was ramping up to maximum lethality. Dr. Grant identified the critical moment when the queen's emotional state would make her most vulnerable to coordinated assault. The creature's metabolism was cycling through predictable patterns based on her stress responses, creating brief windows of opportunity when her defenses would be temporarily compromised. The timing would have to be perfect, but the humans seemed confident in their ability to execute such precise coordination. As they prepared for the final phase of their hunt, Zektar realized with growing amazement that these soft, fragile creatures had somehow turned a desperate survival situation into a controlled scientific experiment. They were not just fighting the Vex High Queen, but studying her, learning her weaknesses, and exploiting her own evolutionary programming to achieve victory against impossible odds. Morrison raised his hand and the team moved with synchronized precision that looked almost choreographed. Zektar watched in fascination as the humans executed their plan with the fluid coordination of predators who had hunted together for years, rather than soldiers who had met only days ago. Each person knew exactly what the others would do and when they would do it, as if they were reading each other's minds. Dr. Grant triggered her modified pheromone broadcast at the exact moment the Queen's stress cycle reached its peak vulnerability. The false chemical signals convinced the massive creature that her offspring were under direct attack from multiple directions, causing her to emit desperate calls for reinforcement that only added to the communications chaos Collins had created. Throughout the hive, Parker moved to his predetermined position and began making sounds that mimicked Vexa-High territorial challenges, triggering the Queen's dominance response patterns just as her protective instincts were overwhelming her tactical awareness. The creature's massive body oriented toward the perceived challenge, exposing the anatomical weak points that Collins had mapped with her scanning equipment. Collins herself had moved to an elevated position where she could coordinate the team's final assault using real-time biological data from Grant's sensors. She called out timing cues and target priorities in calm, clear tones that cut through the chaos of the Queen's thrashing movements and acidic emissions. Her voice remained steady despite the fact that one wrong calculation would result in all their deaths. Morrison waited until the perfect moment when all factors aligned according to their careful planning. The Queen was emotionally compromised, physically positioned for optimal targeting, and temporarily separated from her reinforcements by Collins's communication disruption. He gave the signal and 4 weapons fired simultaneously with mechanical precision. Parker's custom penetrator rounds struck the weak points in the Queen's carapace with devastating accuracy, punching through armor that should have been impervious to conventional weapons. The projectiles had been designed specifically for this creature's anatomy, carrying payloads that disrupted her nervous system while creating massive internal trauma. The Queen's shriek of pain and rage echoed through the chamber as her own biological systems began working against her. Collins's shots targeted the creature's sensory organs with surgical precision, blinding her and destroying her ability to coordinate with the scattered hive forces. Her scanner-guided targeting system had calculated exact angles and penetration depths needed to disable the Queen's compound vision without triggering her most dangerous defensive responses. The massive creature stumbled and thrashed, trying to locate enemies she could no longer see. Dr. Grant's weapon delivered specialized rounds loaded with chemical compounds she had synthesized from local plant materials during their approach to the colony. The projectiles contained toxins that specifically targeted Vex-High metabolism, causing the Queen's own acid production to become erratic and self-destructive. Her defensive secretions began eating through her own carapace from the inside, creating a cascade of biological failures that no amount of natural armor could prevent. Morrison's shots were the most precisely placed of all, targeting nerve clusters that Grant had identified as critical control points for the creature's motor functions. His rounds carried electromagnetic pulse generators that disrupted the bioelectrical signals controlling the Queen's massive limbs, causing temporary paralysis in key muscle groups. The creature's legs gave out beneath her enormous weight, sending her crashing to the chamber floor, but the humans were not finished. As the Queen writhed in pain and confusion, they moved to Phase 2 of their coordinated assault. Parker began placing explosive charges at structural points around the chamber, not to kill the creature directly, but to collapse sections of the ceiling that would trap her in place while they completed their mission. His demolition work was precise and calculated, designed to create specific patterns of debris that would immobilize without completely destroying their target. Collins activated emergency beacon systems that would guide the surviving colonists to safety while simultaneously broadcasting false distress signals that drew the remaining Vex-High away from their position. She had reprogrammed the colony's communication arrays to create multiple phantom emergencies throughout the facility, spreading the alien forces too thin to mount an effective counterattack. Dr. Grant moved closer to the fallen queen and began collecting biological samples with the focused intensity of a researcher who had discovered something unprecedented. She was documenting the creature's physiological responses to their coordinated assault, recording data that could revolutionize the hegemony's understanding of Vex-High biology and behavior patterns. Her scientific curiosity remained stronger than any fear of the massive predator writhing just meters away. Morrison coordinated the evacuation of survivors from the storage room while maintaining tactical awareness of the Queen's condition and the positions of other Vex-High throughout the facility. He moved with the calm efficiency of someone managing a complex operation rather than someone who had just helped kill one of the galaxy's most dangerous creatures. His attention was already shifting to extraction procedures and mission completion rather than celebrating their unlikely victory. The surviving colonists emerged from their hiding place in various states of shock and exhaustion. They stared in amazement at the fallen queen and the humans who had somehow accomplished what entire hegemony battle groups had failed to achieve. Zektar found himself sharing their astonishment as he watched these soft, pale creatures methodically secure the area and prepare for departure. Parker's explosives detonated in sequence, bringing down carefully calculated sections of the chambers, ceiling, and infrastructure. The falling debris created barriers that would prevent the Queen from pursuing them even if she recovered from her injuries, while simultaneously blocking the tunnels that other Vex-High might use to reach the surface. His demolition work was so precise that it created exactly the tactical situation Morrison had requested without risking structural collapse of the entire facility. Collins guided the mixed group of survivors and rescuers through the facility, using routes she had mapped during their infiltration. Her scanner showed that most of the remaining Vex-High were still chasing false signals in distant parts of the complex, leaving their escape path relatively clear. She moved with confident efficiency, leading them through maintenance corridors and service tunnels that avoided the areas where aliens might still be present. Dr. Grant continued taking measurements and collecting samples as they moved, documenting everything she had learned about Vex-High biology and hive behavior during their encounter. She had gathered enough data to keep hegemony xenobiologists busy for years, but more importantly, she had proven that these supposedly invincible predators could be defeated through careful study and precise application of scientific knowledge. Morrison brought up the rear of their group, monitoring their back trail and maintaining communication with the shuttles that would extract them from the planet's surface. His tactical awareness remained sharp despite the successful completion of their primary mission, watching for signs that the Vex-High might reorganize and attempt to prevent their escape. He moved with the patient alertness of a predator who knew that the hunt was not over until all participants had reached safety. As they emerged from the facility into the planet's daylight, Zektar found himself looking at his human companions with completely altered perspective. During their descent into the colony, he had seen them as soft, fragile creatures who might need protection from the galaxy's dangers. Now he understood that he had been looking at apex predators who had spent millions of years evolving the most dangerous hunting capabilities in known space. The shuttles arrived precisely on schedule, their pilots having monitored the mission's progress through Collins' tactical communications. The evacuation proceeded with smooth efficiency as survivors and rescuers boarded the craft for departure. But Zektar noticed that the humans seemed almost disappointed that the encounter was over, as if they had been enjoying the challenge of facing such deadly opponents. During the flight back to the Convergence, Dr. Grant briefed Morrison and the others on her preliminary findings about Vex-High biology and behavior patterns. She had discovered weaknesses and vulnerabilities that could be exploited in future encounters, turning the galaxy's most feared predators into manageable tactical problems rather than unstoppable forces of destruction. Her tone was that of a scientist discussing successful research rather than someone who had barely survived a nightmare scenario. Parker cleaned his weapons and organized his remaining equipment with the satisfied expression of someone who had completed a challenging but enjoyable task. He had collected several Vex-High claws as trophies and was already planning modifications to his gear based on lessons learned during the engagement. His casual attitude toward the deadly encounter made it clear that he viewed such dangers as interesting problems to be solved rather than threats to be feared.